The genome sequence unspooled across Mara's screen like a confession from something very old and very frightened, and she almost missed it. She had been awake for 31 hours. The Vale-Keth Medical Archive was cold enough that she could see her breath whenever the climate system cycled, and the ambient lighting, deep violet, calibrated for eyes that operated on a different frequency than hers, gave everything in the room the quality of a bruise. The chair she'd been assigned was designed for a Vale-Keth body and held her at the wrong angle. Her coffee had gone cold 4 hours ago. The toast she'd brought from the accommodation unit in a paper sleeve was hard at the edges, and she hadn't eaten it. None of this mattered, because 3 hours ago she had found something in the Queen's genetic sequence that should not exist, and since then she had not moved except to pull up comparison data and stare at it with the particular stillness of a person who is afraid that if they blink, the thing they've found will turn out to be a mistake. It was not a mistake. Dr. Mara Voss was 38 years old, from Hanover originally, with a doctorate in xenobiology from Göttingen and a secondary specialty in alien reproductive genetics that had, until 2 years ago, been almost entirely theoretical. She was not remarkable in the ways that made news. She had never brokered a treaty, never stood at a podium before cameras, never had her face attached to any of the landmark moments in human-alien relations that people hung on their living room walls now that the conquered was 7 years old. She was a scientist who worked in archives and spoke very quietly, and could read Vale-Keth genetic notation in the original biological encoding, which approximately 40 humans on Earth could do, and she had been sent here because the Vale-Keth Empress Council had requested, through diplomatic channels so discreet they barely existed, a xenobiologist with specific credentials to assist with what they called an ongoing archival research project. She had assumed it was routine. Comparative taxonomy, perhaps, cross-species enzyme cataloging, the kind of careful, unglamorous work that kept the conquered scientific exchange programs running and gave both species something to point to when the politicians needed evidence that the relationship was productive. She had packed for 6 weeks. She had arranged for a colleague to feed her cat. She had told her department head she would have a preliminary report ready by the 5th week. 3 hours ago, she had understood what it actually was. The archive room was on the 7th level of the Vale-Keth consulate in the Threshold district, behind a security corridor that required biometric confirmation at 4 separate stations, and Mara had been working alone since the archivist assigned to supervise her had stepped out at the 3rd hour and not returned. She had not found this unusual until she found the sequence anomaly. The Vale-Keth were meticulous about protocol in ways that made human diplomatic staff look improvised and casual. They did not leave their researchers unsupervised by accident. When she understood what she was looking at, she understood also that she had not been left alone by oversight. She had been left alone with it deliberately. She pulled up the Vale-Keth Imperial Genetic Index, the public one, the version that had been shared with the conquered scientific bodies as part of the exchange protocols, and ran the comparison. The gap appeared immediately, obvious once you knew what you were looking at, invisible if you didn't. In the public record, the Vale-Keth royal bloodline House Vale-Keth, the founding lineage of the empire, the genetic heritage from which the eternal sovereign drew her authority and the empire drew its legitimacy, was annotated as stable, continuous, vigorous. The notation system used 4 markers for bloodline health, and all 4 showed green. In the private record, the one Mara had been given access to as part of her research credentials, the same bloodline showed something different. 3 of the 4 markers were still green. The 4th, the one that indexed reproductive continuity, the biological mechanism by which the royal bloodline could produce the next generation of Vale-Keth with the specific genetic signature that the empire's succession law required, was not green. It was not yellow, it was not even orange. It was a color Mara had never seen in this notation system before, and she'd had to query the archive's interpretive index to understand it. The system returned the translation in 3 languages. In Vale-Keth High Register, it was rendered as a word that meant something like final. In the Concord's diplomatic tongue, it came back as terminal. In English, which the archive had apparently been calibrated to include at some point in the last several years, it said the same word in smaller letters. Extinct. Mara sat very still and looked at that word for a long time. Then she got up, went to the window, and looked down at the city below the consulate. The Threshold district moved through its afternoon with the ordinary indifference of cities, people and vehicles, and light moving in patterns that had no awareness of what was collapsing in the archive's 7 floors above them. She stood there and thought about what kind of empire looked at extinction and called it perfection, and hid its mechanism of death so completely that the galaxy had been watching it for 7 years and hadn't noticed. Then she went back to the screen and began working, because that was what she did. The Queen was not what Mara had expected. She had been introduced to her eternal grace, sovereign of the bloodline, Queen Isivarith of House Vale-Keth on Mara's 2nd day at the archive. A brief formal meeting that she had understood was ceremonial, a diplomatic courtesy extended to the human researcher before she was installed in the lower levels and forgotten. Queens did not usually spend time with xenobiologists. Mara had prepared a short statement of gratitude and professional intent, had rehearsed it twice in her accommodation unit that morning, and had delivered it with adequate composure, despite the fact that Isivarith was, in the way of the Vale-Keth, extraordinarily beautiful in a manner that had nothing to do with any of the normal criteria, not symmetry or proportion or any of the things human aesthetics defaulted to. It was older than that. The beauty of something that had existed long enough to become precisely itself. She was tall and pale and precise, with the deep arterial eyes common to her kind and hair so dark it held blue in strong light, and she moved through the formal receiving room with the quality of someone who had spent centuries learning to make ceremony look effortless. She had listened to Mara's prepared statement with an expression that was politely attentive and entirely opaque. She had said, in accented but precise English, "We hope your work here will be productive, Dr. Voss. The archive is at your disposal." That was supposed to be the end of it. On the 4th day, however, Mara had looked up from a particularly complex section of the genetic sequence to find the Queen standing in the doorway of the archive room, alone, without the attendants who had accompanied her on the 2nd day, and looking at Mara with an expression that was not the politely opaque one from the receiving room. It was quieter and more complicated, and it lasted only a moment before Isivarith composed it back into courtesy. "I apologize for the interruption," she said. "You're not interrupting," Mara said, and then remembered she was speaking to a queen and added nothing further, which turned out to be the right choice. Isivarith came into the room and stood beside the screens Mara had been working on. She looked at the sequence data without touching anything, and her eyes moved across it with the fluency of someone who understood every line, which Mara had already suspected. The archive's research access had been configured by someone who knew exactly what they were giving her permission to find. "You have good instincts," Isivarith said finally. "I'm a very thorough researcher," Mara said carefully. "Yes." Isivarith turned from the screen and met her eyes directly, which with Vale-Keth was a deliberate act, not a casual one. "That is why you were selected." Mara said, "Selected for what exactly?" The Queen was quiet for a moment. Outside the narrow window, the Threshold district moved through its afternoon, oblivious. Then Isivarith said, with the same careful precision she'd used for her welcome speech 2 days ago, except that now it carried something underneath it that was not ceremony. "To understand what the Empire will not allow itself to understand. And perhaps, Dr. Voss, if you are willing, to find something that my own people have decided cannot be found." Mara looked at her. She thought about the word on the screen behind them, the one in smaller letters, the English translation that the archive had been calibrated to produce at some specific point in the last several years. She thought about 40 humans who could read Vale-Keth genetic notation, and the fact that she had been the one sent. She said, "Tell me what I'm looking for." The lottery had no official name. In Vale-Keth law, the ancient law, the version that predated the conquered by 11 centuries, it was referred to only as the right of continuation. The framing was religious in origin, a covenant between the founding bloodlines and what the Vale-Keth called the long future, the governing philosophy by which the empire managed its own near immortality. The Vale-Keth did not die easily. Their biology was extraordinary by any comparative standard. Cellular repair mechanisms that could address damage that would be fatal to a human in hours, an immune architecture so sophisticated that most pathogens simply failed to register, a metabolic efficiency that made their bodies extraordinarily difficult to exhaust. They had been, for most of their recorded history, the closest thing in the known galaxy to a species that had beaten death. The cost of this, which they had understood for centuries, was reproductive constraint. Species that do not die easily do not need to reproduce frequently, and the Vale-Keth breeding cycle was long and rare and deeply dependent on genetic diversity across bloodlines. The founding law had recognized this. It had established the bloodline system, the great houses of the empire, each maintaining their specific genetic heritage, each required by law to reproduce within defined parameters to keep the species' collective genome viable. It was a sophisticated system, and for most of its history it had worked. What Mara had found in the archive, buried under 11 centuries of careful notation and deliberate misdirection, was the other part of that founding law, the part that was not in the public record, the part that the Vale-Keth Empire had been administering quietly and without acknowledgement since long before humanity had learned to build fire. When a bloodline failed, when its reproductive viability collapsed below the threshold that the founding law defined as sustainable, it was not permitted to simply decline. A failing bloodline was, in the law's language, a wound in the long future, and wounds were cauterized. The rite of continuation was not a ritual to preserve continuity. It was a ritual to end the bloodline that could no longer contribute to it. The lottery, and it was a lottery in the most literal sense, a randomized selection governed by an algorithmic process so old that no living Vale-Keth had written the original code, selected the terminal generation's last surviving carrier. The sentinel was dispatched. The rite was administered. The public announcement, made to the empire's population and to the conquered's diplomatic observers, was always the same. The bloodline had been retired in honor, its last sovereign choosing to complete the long future covenant freely and with dignity. In the 7 years since the conquered had brought human and Vale-Keth into formal contact, 3 bloodlines had been retired. Mara spent an afternoon looking up all 3. The conquered's diplomatic record held them brief, formal, written in the high register. Each one described a noble and voluntary conclusion. Each used the same phrasing. Each had been followed within 6 months by a significant reorganization of the dead bloodline's holdings, territories, and archival records. The language of erasure disguised as ceremony, so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine grief. She sat in the cold archive room and looked at the data and thought about a city that called itself perfect because it had hidden what perfection cost. Then she looked at the 4th sequence in her research files, the one that bore the notation extinct. House Vale-Keth, the royal bloodline, the eternal sovereign's own line. The lottery had already run. She found the timestamp in the administrative subdirectory that her credentials, given deliberately, she now understood fully, allowed her to access. The selection had been made 14 days ago. The sentinel had been assigned. The rite of continuation was scheduled. The date on the administrative record was 6 days from now. Mara closed her eyes. She sat in the dark behind her eyelids for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and she thought about a civilization that had spent 11 centuries maintaining a lie that death had been defeated, that used a lottery to select who it killed in order to keep the lie intact. A city of perfection. A sovereign whose bloodline was marked terminal, while the public record showed 4 green markers, 4 symbols that meant stable and continuous and eternal. She thought about what it took to build something like that. Not just the law, any civilization could write a law. She thought about the accumulated effort of generations, each one receiving from the last the understanding that this was how things worked, that the right was a covenant and the lottery was a mechanism, and the result was always framed as dignity, as a choice made by the bloodline itself, as a kind of nobility. She thought about how a lie became a truth when it was old enough, and how the truth became the framework, and how the framework became the thing that brilliant people worked inside without ever looking at its shape from the outside. She had been outside it from the beginning because she was human, and she had learned the language from books without a teacher, and she had never known what the books were for. She opened her eyes. She pulled up the reproductive viability sequence. She began to work. The night came and went outside the narrow window. She did not notice it. The city went dark and then gray and then light again, and she noticed that only because the quality of the air through the climate system changed slightly at dawn, a fraction of a degree warmer, some calibration adjustment that the building made automatically for a shift in the ambient temperature outside. She noted it the way she noted the cold in her hands and the ache in her back, and the fact that the hardened toast from the accommodation unit was still on the desk, uneaten. And none of these things were the things she was working on, so none of them occupied more than a small fraction of her attention. At some point during the second night, someone slid a tray of food under the door without knocking. She ate it while looking at the screen, not tasting it, and she did not look at the door to see if anyone was still in the corridor. She thought she knew who had left it. The answer took shape the way scientific answers did, not in a single moment of illumination, but in a series of small confirmations, each one tightening the structure until it held. She ran the model. She ran it again with different parameters. She ran it a third time, which was the time that functioned as confirmation rather than verification. The run you did not because you doubted the result, but because you needed to hear it 3 times before you trusted yourself to act on it. It held all 3 times. She printed the analysis. She stood up. She knocked on the door and asked to see the Queen. She worked for 2 days without sleeping. The Veilketh cellular biology was extraordinary, and Mara knew enough to be awed by it even under these circumstances, because that was the kind of scientist she was, the kind who could be frightened and determined and awed simultaneously, who could look at a collapsing genome and see both the tragedy and the mechanism. The cold archive room became a kind of world. She ate the food that appeared on a tray outside the door at intervals, left by someone she never saw. She drank too much coffee and not enough water. She did not sleep. She pulled up 700 years of reproductive research that the Veilketh specialists had conducted and organized it chronologically, and read through each approach, with the particular attention of someone who is not looking for what worked but for the shape of what failed, because failure always has a shape, and the shape tells you which wall the researchers kept running into. The wall in this case was the Veilketh immune system. The reproductive failure in the royal bloodline was elegant in its brutality. It was not a disease in any conventional sense, not damage or infection or environmental trauma. It was mathematical. The founding law's genetic parameters, built into the bloodline's breeding requirements over 11 centuries, had over time created a recursion problem. The constraints that maintained House Veilketh's specific genetic signature had slowly, inexorably, narrowed the viable pool of reproductive partners, until the bloodline was attempting to sustain itself with a compatibility range that had dropped below the statistical threshold for continuation. It was not that the Queen was infertile. It was that the genetic landscape she required, the specific Vale-Keth signature that the law demanded her offspring carry, no longer existed in sufficient diversity to produce a stable next generation. The Empire's own genetic specialists had worked on this problem for 60 years. They had tried 17 different therapeutic approaches. Each had failed at the same point. The Vale-Keth genome's repair mechanisms, so extraordinary in every other context, treated the introduced diversity as contamination and systematically corrected it out of the sequence before fertilization could occur. The body was trying to save itself by doing the thing that was killing it. The immune system of an immortal species, encountering something unfamiliar, defaulted to elimination. It was, Mara thought somewhere around the 15th hour, the most Vale-Keth problem she had ever encountered. She got up and walked to the window and stood there in the dark city below and thought for a long time about the structure of a biological system designed to recognize threat, and what the word threat meant to something that had been immortal long enough to forget what mortal felt like. Then she went back to the desk and pulled up comparative human genetic data. The Concord scientific exchange had included substantial human genomic documentation, and the Vale-Keth had been studying it carefully. She could tell by the annotation structure, the way the data had been organized and cross-referenced, the evidence of attention over time. She ran the comparison sequence. She was looking for something specific, not a cure, not a therapy, not one of the 17 approaches that had already failed. She was looking for a mechanism that the Vale-Keth specialists had not tried because it had not occurred to them to look for it. A mechanism that required, structurally, the involvement of something outside the Vale-Keth biological framework entirely. Not a different variant of Vale-Keth genetics. Something genuinely other. She found it at hour 22. It was in the Vale-Keth cellular repair architecture itself, the very system that had been treating introduced genetic diversity as contamination. The repair mechanism operated on a recognition system, a biological key that identified sequences as self or other. Vale-Keth specialists had spent 60 years trying to introduce compatible diversity through the front door, sequences close enough to Vale-Keth biology that they might pass as self. The immune system had caught every single attempt, because everything they'd tried was still recognizable as almost self, and almost self was the exact category the repair system was calibrated to correct. But there was a back door. There had always been a back door, because no biological system was designed without one. You couldn't build a repair mechanism that could recognize self without building, by definition, a category for things that were different enough from self to be ignored rather than corrected. The Vale-Keth repair system corrected what it recognized as almost self. It ignored what it recognized as entirely other. Human DNA was, from the Vale-Keth repair system's perspective, so fundamentally different that it didn't register as a threat. It registered as background, environmental, irrelevant. Which meant that a human genetic contributor, not a replacement, not a dominant sequence, but a catalyst, a chemical bridge introduced through direct biological contact, could theoretically reach the reproductive substrate of the Vale-Keth sequence without triggering the correction response, because the correction response was not calibrated to notice it. The Vale-Keth specialists hadn't tried it because the idea of using human biology as a therapeutic agent in a royal bloodline continuation would have been, in the pre-Concord era, literally unthinkable. Not forbidden, not studied and rejected, unthinkable. The kind of thing that was so far outside the framework that it never occurred to anyone to consider it, the way a person who has spent their entire life in one room does not think to wonder what is in the next room because the next room, to them, does not exist. Myra looked at her data for a long time, then she looked at the clock, 4 days left. She printed the analysis. She walked to the door of the archive room and into the corridor, and she asked the Vale-Keth guard stationed there, in her careful formal accent, "I need to speak to the Queen." Isavarath read the analysis 3 times. They were in a private room 2 floors above the archive, a room that had no windows and no recording equipment. Mara had asked, and the Queen had answered with a directness that suggested she had been waiting for someone to ask. The room was a working space, plain by Valenketh standards, with a long table and chairs designed for their body type and a single lighting source that gave everything a gray underwater quality. They sat across from each other, and Isavarath read, and Mara waited, and outside the building the city continued in its oblivious perfection. After the 3rd reading, Isavarath set the pages down and looked at the table for a moment. "The sentinel has been in the building for a week," she said. "He moves through the lower levels on a schedule. He is courteous. He follows protocol. He is waiting for the certification to be completed so he can carry out the rite." "I know," Mara said. "Everyone in this building knows," Isavarath said. "The staff, the guards, the archivists. They know and they follow their own protocols because that is the structure of this society. No one dies in the city of perfection. That is what we tell ourselves. That is what we tell the galaxy. And when someone must die, when the lottery selects someone, the system administers it so thoroughly, so courteously, so procedurally, that it does not look like what it is." She paused. "I have spent 3 months knowing that my name would be on the lottery's result. I have spent those months being very courteous about it, because that is what is required." Mara said, "You found a loophole." "I found what has always been there." Isavarath looked at her directly. "Our law requires that a final review be conducted before the rite can be certified. A credentialed reviewer with full archive access must examine the record and confirm that no viable solution exists. This has been for 11 centuries a formality. The reviewer is always a Valenketh specialist. The specialist has always already worked on the problem. They confirm what they already know." She paused. "The law does not specify the species of the reviewer. You gave a human researcher access to an archive she was supposed to have access to anyway," Mara said slowly, "under credentials that gave her permission to find exactly what needed to be found, and then you left her alone in it." "The review must be conducted," Isavarath said. "I conducted it. What the law does not specify cannot be used against it." Mara sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "If my analysis is documented in the official archive record in the required notation format by a credentialed reviewer before the rite's administration date, the certification requires confirmation that no viable solution exists," Isavarath said. "If a viable solution is documented, the confirmation cannot be made. If the certification is not completed, the sentinel cannot proceed." She looked at Mara's 9 pages. "You will need to test the contact mechanism. I will need to confirm that the catalyst responds as your model predicts." "Direct skin contact," Mara said. "My hands, your tissue. The inner wrist, the pulse point, closest to the reproductive vascular substrate." "Yes." Isavarath held out her right wrist. The skin there was the gray-white of her kind, and beneath it Mara could see the faint suggestion of vascular structure, different from human vessels, more branched, running in a pattern that she recognized from the anatomical diagrams in the archive. She looked at her own hands, ink-stained, 38 years old, the hands of someone who spent her life in archives. She reached across the table and placed 2 fingers at the pulse point, light enough to read the vascular rhythm, firm enough to establish the epidermal contact the protocol required. The Queen went very still. Not the courteous stillness of ceremony. Something different. Something that was happening inside the biology Mara was touching, the cellular architecture responding to the contact in the way her model had predicted, not with the correction response, not with the immune system's trained elimination reflex, but with something quieter and more fundamental. The recognition of something entirely other, processed not as threat but as information. The back door opening. After 40 seconds, Mara removed her fingers and wrote down the results on the corner of her analysis printout. "The mechanism responds," she said. Yes, Isavarith said. Her voice was slightly different, not disrupted, not emotional, but changed in some small way, like a room where a window has been opened. I felt it. I'll need to formalize this as a controlled test in the documentation. Mara was already writing. Time, contact duration, observed response indicators, in the required notation format. There are 4 days, Isavarith said. 3.5, Mara said and kept writing. She worked without stopping for the remaining 3.5 days, pausing only to eat the food that continued to appear on the tray outside the door, and to walk the length of the archive room 4 times at the halfway point of each long session to keep the blood moving in her legs. The sentinel was somewhere in the building. She tracked his movement through the internal notification system Isavarith had added to her access credentials without explanation. He moved through the lower floors with the patient regularity of a professional waiting for paperwork to clear. She filed the viable solution documentation in the certification queue with 3 hours to spare. Then she went to the Queen's private chamber and sat in the chair beside the window and looked at the city and waited, because there was one procedural question she had not been able to answer from the archive: how long the committee review would take. The certification queue would process her submission. The right committee would receive it. They would need to convene and review it before the Sentinel's certification could be completed. All of this was procedurally sound. What she could not determine was whether the committee would find a way to process it quickly enough to clear the certification before her submission could be formally considered. The Sentinel arrived at 9 in the morning building time and moved through the consulate's security levels with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been here a week and knew every corridor. She watched the indicator markers move through the notification system. 7th floor, 6th, 5th. Isavarith sat across the room completely still, hands folded. Not peace, not surrender. The posture of someone who had decided to hold their composure as a form of resistance, who had spent 3 months being courteous about an ending, and was now doing the same with the possibility of something else. The committee, Mara said. They received it, Isavarith said. I was notified an hour ago. And they are reviewing it carefully. A pause that carried the specific weight of 11 centuries of institutional momentum, encountering something it had not been designed to encounter. They will look for every procedural basis to find it non-compliant. 4th floor. Mara stood up. What are you doing? Isavarith said. What I came here to do, Mara said, and it was not an answer she could have fully explained, but she understood its structure. The distance between where she was and where she needed to be was not a consideration. She had made that determination somewhere between the window in the archive room and the moment she'd placed her fingers on the Queen's wrist, and it did not require further deliberation. She walked into the corridor and down the stairs and onto the 4th floor, which was a long, clean passage with the Veilketh's characteristic deep-tinted lighting, and the smell of the consulate's filtered air, cool and faintly mineral, like stones at the bottom of a deep-running stream. And she found the sentinel at the far end. He was tall and dressed in the black of the procedural corps, and he stopped when he saw her. His face was the careful neutral of Veilketh professionals, the expression that held everything behind it at a precise controlled distance. He was not cruel. She understood that, looking at him, with the clarity that came from 3.5 days without sleep and 31 hours before that, and the specific quality of exhaustion that sharpens rather than dulls certain kinds of perception. He was a person doing the job that his civilization had decided needed doing, moving through a system so old and so thoroughly normalized that the question of whether it should exist had long since been replaced by the question of how it should be administered. He was not the thing that had built this. He was the person at the end of it. Dr. Voss, he said. I know what you're here to do, Mara said. Then you understand that I must ask you to return to your quarters, politely. No hostility. the tone of someone managing a procedural complication. "I've submitted a viable solution to the certification committee," Mara said. "I am aware," he paused. "The committee's review is not complete." "Then your certification isn't complete," Mara said. "Your certification requires committee confirmation that no viable solution exists. The committee has not made that confirmation. Without the confirmation, the right cannot be certified. Without the certification, the right cannot proceed. And without the right's certification, you cannot pass this point." She was standing in the corridor. The sentinel was 3 meters from her. Between them was empty air, no door, no barrier, no physical restraint. He was taller than her by a substantial margin and had been doing this job, she suspected, for considerably longer than she had been alive. He could have walked around her. She was aware of that. She had thought about it on the stairs, coming down, and arrived at a conclusion that did not depend on physics. She was not there to provide a physical barrier. She was there to make the thing she was doing real and witnessed and documented, to say out loud the procedural word that the law required be said before it could proceed. The word was, wait. "My certification," the sentinel said, after a pause of exactly the right length to indicate that something was happening in whatever internal communication channel connected him to the committee, "has not been completed." He met her eyes with his precise, deep-red gaze. "I am instructed to wait for committee confirmation." Mara breathed for what felt like the first time in 3.5 days. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for one more moment. She could not read Veilketh nonverbal language with fluency. It was one of the genuine gaps in human xenobiological study, but she thought she saw something in his face that was not resentment and not contempt. A kind of recognition. The look of a person on the opposite side of something who can see, briefly, the shape of what they have in common. Then he stepped aside, not forward, aside. They waited in the corridor together in the cold violet light. She leaned against the wall. He stood. Neither of them spoke. Outside, somewhere below, the city maintained its perfect indifferent rhythm, and 11 minutes passed, and then the notification came through on her handheld. The committee's response was written in procedural language, designed to make significant things look routine, which Mara read as a small and specific mercy. The viable solution submission had been reviewed. The notation and methodology were found compliant. The cross-species reproductive catalyst mechanism was flagged for further scientific review and validation. A matter of months, not days. But the theoretical viability assessment met the threshold, the right certification requirements defined as sufficient to preclude immediate administration. The Sentinel's certification was suspended. The right of continuation for House Veilketh was suspended pending scientific review. Mara sat down on the floor of the corridor, which was undignified and entirely outside the kind of behavior the Veilketh consulate was designed to accommodate, and put her face in her hands, and stayed there for a moment that was not ceremony and not protocol, and not anything except the particular collapse of someone who has been holding a specific tension for 3.5 days, and is no longer required to hold it. The sentinel's footsteps moved back toward the elevator. The sound faded. The corridor was quiet. When she looked up, Issavareth was standing at the end of it. The queen had come down the stairs herself, no attendants, no ceremony, and she was standing in the cold violet light with the posture that was not peace and not surrender, and not any of the performed things Mara had seen her use across 9 days of formal interactions. There was something in her face that had been held at a controlled distance for 3 months and was now permitted, carefully, to exist. She walked toward Mara and stopped, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Issavareth said, "This is not finished." "I know," Mara said from the floor. The committee suspended the right. They did not accept the solution. There will be a formal validation process. Every specialist in the empire who has worked on this problem for 60 years and has professional investment in having failed will review your work and find every basis to challenge it. She paused. They will be very thorough. Then I'll have to be more thorough, Mara said, which was the same thing she had said 5 days ago in the archive room, and she watched Issavarith's face do something that was not quite a smile, but contained the material from which a smile could eventually be made. You will need access to the complete archive, Issavarith said, materials not yet disclosed to the conquered, the cooperation of the Empire's specialists, which I cannot guarantee but can encourage. Time and accommodations beyond your original allocation. A pause. You will be working against 11 centuries of law and 60 years of professional pride. Mara looked at her hands, ink-stained, ordinary, shaped by 10,000 years of a species that had arrived late to the galaxy and had nothing to unlearn and had spent most of its recorded history stubbornly insisting that the distance between where it was and where it needed to be was not a constraint. She stood up. Yes, she said. Do you want to show me where the full archive is? The validation process took 9 months. It was exactly as difficult as Issavarith had described. The Empire's genetic specialists were brilliant and had the specific ferocity of experts defending decades of work against a theory that implied their framework had contained a structural blind spot from the beginning. They challenged the cross-species catalyst mechanism at 14 separate points across 6 formal hearings. They filed 8 procedural objections. They produced a counter-study arguing that the human genetic contribution would be catalytically insufficient at the required depth, which Mara rebutted in the 4th month with a modified delivery protocol developed from 300 controlled simulations run on the archive's modeling system. When they challenged the simulation parameters, she ran 300 more with modified inputs and showed that the core mechanism held across the full variable range. She ate badly and slept in irregular intervals and learned, gradually, which of the archive's coffee equivalents was tolerable, and which would keep her awake for 14 hours in a way that became counterproductive. She developed a working professional relationship with 2 of the specialists who had initially been her most persistent challengers, based on the shared language of people who cared very much about methodology, even when they disagreed about conclusions. She learned 26 additional words in the Veilketh scientific register that were not in any human dictionary, because the Conquered's linguistic exchange had not yet reached the specificity of molecular biology terminology, and she needed them. The hardest part was not the challenges from the specialists. The hardest part was the 3rd month, when the second procedural objection argued that her initial experimental test, 2 fingers at the pulse point for 40 seconds, in a private room with no external witnesses, was insufficiently documented to qualify as a controlled trial in the archive's research framework, and therefore could not be cited as evidentiary support for the mechanism's viability claim. It was technically correct. She had documented it on the corner of a printout in her own handwriting, timed on her personal wristwatch, observed by only herself and the subject. By any rigorous research standard, it was preliminary data, not a controlled trial. The objection was filed by a specialist named Verath, who was the youngest member of the validation panel and who asked the sharpest questions. And when Mara read the objection, she sat with it for an afternoon and acknowledged, privately and specifically, that Verath was right. Then she designed a proper controlled trial and submitted it for approval under the archive's research protocols. The trial required 3 sessions, each independently witnessed by 2 Veilketh archivists, with the biological response measured by the consulate's medical monitoring equipment rather than Mara's personal assessment. It required Issavarith's formal consent as the subject, documented in the research record, which the Queen provided in a brief meeting in the archive room during which she read the protocol with the focused attention she gave to everything, and then signed it with the precise, unhurried signature of someone who had been making formal decisions for centuries and was not going to stop now. The first session was in the archive room, at the table where Mara had first shown the Queen her analysis printout. The archivists positioned the monitoring equipment. Mara reviewed the protocol once more, not because she didn't know it, but because she had been taught that the moment before a controlled trial was the moment when you owed the work your full attention, not just the part of you that was confident. She checked the equipment calibration. She checked the timer. Then she looked at Isavarith across the table. The Queen met her eyes. There was no ceremony in it. There was the particular quality of a person who had spent 3 months deciding how to hold what was coming and had arrived, through that long process, at a version of stillness that was not resignation. Something that understood the difference between accepting an ending and accepting a beginning. The distinction was narrow and cost everything, and Isavarith held it with both hands. Mara placed 2 fingers at the pulse point. The monitoring equipment registered the cellular response immediately, not dramatic, not visible on the surface, but precise in the way that biological data is precise. A specific change in the vascular substrate activity at the contact site that matched the model's prediction within a 3% margin. The response pattern was exactly as the mechanism required. Not the correction reflex, not the immune system's trained elimination response, but the other category. The category that said, entirely other. The category that processed rather than defended. She held the contact for 40 seconds and then removed her fingers and wrote the observation time in the log and sat back, and the witnesses documented without comment. Mara documented without comment. Isavarith sat across the table and was very still, and her face was the face of someone listening to something that was happening inside them, something they could feel but not describe. She said afterward quietly, "It does not feel like what I expected." "What did you expect?" Mara said. Isavarith considered the question with the seriousness she gave to all questions. "Something foreign," she said. "Something that would feel like an intrusion." She paused. "It feels like nothing in the way that background feels like nothing. As if it was always going to be permitted to be there." Mara wrote that down too, in the qualitative observations column, in plain language rather than notation, because the notation system did not have a code for what the Queen had just described. That was, she thought, the point. The second and third sessions confirmed the same pattern. Verath's procedural objection was formally answered in the 5th month, and the controlled trial results were entered into the archive as primary evidentiary data. Mara wrote the formal rebuttal in the required notation format, and filed it with a precision that she was aware was slightly more thorough than strictly necessary, which was something she had inherited from nobody specific, and from everyone she had ever worked alongside. The Concord's scientific observer, a biologist named Dr. Priya Nair from Chennai, contacted her in the 6th month to say that she had been reading the validation submissions and had a question about the backdoor mechanism. They spent 3 hours on a communication link that the Concord's diplomatic infrastructure provided at no small bureaucratic cost, and at the end of it, Dr. Nair said, "You know you're going to have to publish this regardless of the outcome here. The cross-species catalyst framework alone is worth 15 years of follow-on research." "I know," Mara said. "The Veilketh are going to resist it becoming a Concord scientific publication. It implies things about their biological framework that they would prefer to present in their own terms." "I know that too." Mara looked at the archive room around her, the violet light, the cold air, the screens that held 9 months of the most interesting work she had ever done. "We'll negotiate it. That's what the Concord is for." Dr. Nair was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's it like, being there for this long?" Mara thought about the question. It was the kind of question that a person asked when they were really asking something more specific, and she waited to understand what that was. "It's like being the only person in a very large library," she said finally, "who learned to read the language from the outside. Everyone else learned it from a teacher who learned it from a teacher going back 11 centuries. I learned it from the books without knowing what the books were for. and that turns out to matter. She heard Dr. Nair write something down. Then, take care of yourself, eat something. I'm eating, Mara said. Eat something that isn't coffee, Dr. Nair said and disconnected. The Concord's observer was not wrong about the publication question. Soreth raised it formally in the 7th month, not as an objection but as a request for clarification about the intellectual provenance of the methodology. Specifically, whether the cross-species catalyst framework developed by a human researcher using Vailketh archival materials would be classified as human research, Vailketh research, or joint Concord research. The distinction mattered for the archive's attribution system, and it mattered for something larger than the attribution system, which both Soreth and Mara understood without either of them saying it directly. Mara wrote her response carefully over 2 days, which was longer than she usually spent on correspondence. She explained that the methodology had been developed using her own analytical framework applied to Vailketh biological data that had been made available to her through official Concord research exchange protocols. The data was Vailketh. The framework was human. The result was neither and both. She proposed that it be classified as joint Concord research, with attribution to her as primary researcher and to the Vailketh Medical Archive as primary data source. She noted that this classification was new territory for both the Concord's archival system and the Vailkeths, and that she was happy to work with the appropriate administrative bodies to establish the precedent correctly, which would take time but was worth doing properly. Soreth did not respond for 4 days. Then he sent a single line in the Vailketh Scientific Register that Mara's translation system rendered as, "Agreed, subject to appropriate administrative process." She read it 3 times. Then she went and got coffee, real coffee, which the accommodation unit the consulate had provided for her 3rd month onward was capable of making in a way that suggested someone had looked up human nutritional requirements and concluded that caffeine was a functional necessity, and drank it standing by the window, looking out at the city. Thinking about 11 centuries, and the specific shape of a framework large enough to contain the long future and narrow enough to have missed this one thing for 60 years. The city looked the same as it always had, perfect, indifferent, maintained. She went back to work. The sentinel remained in the consulate. The suspension required his continued presence procedurally for as long as the right remained in review. He moved through the building on a modified schedule, less purposeful now, more patient. They passed each other in the corridors occasionally and acknowledged each other with the brief nod of people who had stood in a hallway together at a significant moment and had no particular need to discuss it further. Once in the 6th month, he came to the archive room doorway and stood there in a way that reminded her of Isavareth 9 months earlier, and she waited, and he said, "You understand that if your solution fails validation, the right proceeds." "I know," Mara said. "You could have stepped aside." "In the corridor." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about the question. It deserved a real answer, she said, because someone had to say wait, and I was the one standing there. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said something in Vailketh that her translation system rendered approximately as, "The act of witness carries its own weight in the long future." Then he walked back down the corridor, and she returned to the simulation she had been running, and they did not have that conversation again. The final validation hearing was held in the 9th month before a panel of 7 committee members, 4 imperial genetic specialists, a Concord scientific observer, and Isavareth in her formal capacity as sovereign of the bloodline under review. The lead specialist was a Vailketh named Soreth who had spent 40 years on the bloodline problem and who had been Mara's most persistent and most rigorous challenger. He was ancient in the way that only the Vailketh could be, not aged, exactly, but compressed, as though time had not worn him down but pressed him into a denser form of himself. He had written 2 of the 8 procedural objections and had asked the sharpest questions at every hearing, and Mara had come to understand him across 9 months as a scientist of exceptional rigor, who had been wrong in a specific and structurally determined way for a very long time. He sat at the committee table and read her final submission in silence for 12 minutes. The room was quiet. The deep violet light of the Vale-Keth consulate pressed in from the panels above, and Mara sat across the table from the oldest professional adversary she had ever had, and waited. Soreth looked up. He said something in the high register that Mara's translation system flagged as a formality indicating technical concession. Then he looked at the rest of the panel and said something else, more briefly, which the system rendered as, "The methodology is sound." The panel voted 5-2. The viable solution was certified. The Sentinel's file was closed. The right of continuation for House Vale-Keth was permanently suspended. In the language of the Empire's procedural law, the bloodline had been found to have a path of continuation and was no longer in terminal status. The announcement to the Empire and to the Concord's diplomatic observers would describe, in the high register formality of official communication, a breakthrough in reproductive science achieved through the Concord's scientific exchange program, which was both accurate and a thorough exercise in understatement. Mara heard the result read aloud and stood very still and did not trust herself to move for a moment. Then she gathered her materials and walked out of the hearing room and leaned against the wall of the corridor outside and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Soreth came out 3 minutes later. He stopped when he saw her. "I would like to understand the specific angle of your approach," he said. "You worked in comparative xenobiology for 11 years before the Concord, all of it theoretical. In that time, what taught you to look for the back door?" Mara lowered her eyes from the ceiling. She considered the question seriously because it was seriously asked. "Nothing in particular," she said. "We're a young species. We don't have 60 years of investment in one framework. When I look at your biology, I don't have anything to unlearn first." Soreth considered that for a long moment. "We were unable, in 40 years, to see the immune system as the problem rather than the resource. Our assumption was always that the solution must be compatible with it." "A human wouldn't know to assume that," Mara said. "We don't understand your biology well enough to assume anything about it. We just look at what's there." Soreth was quiet. Then he said, in the measured high register, "Your methodology has been entered into the Imperial Genetic Archive as the founding reference for cross-species reproductive catalysis. It is the first human-originated research in that archive." Mara said, "Thank you." "I objected to you 14 times, he said. 12, Mara said. 2 of them were actually correct and improved the final result. Soreth looked at her with the particular quality of Vale-Keth expressions that she had learned, across 9 months, to read as something adjacent to quiet amusement. 14 times, he said, firmly, and walked away. She was packing her materials on the last morning, when Isavarith came to the archive room. The Queen had been formally present throughout the validation process, required by the Bloodline Review statutes, but they had not spoken privately since the corridor on the morning of the suspension. Not because of distance, because there was a quality to what had happened between them that neither of them had attempted to categorize, which seemed correct. Some things needed to be real for a while before they could be named. Isavarith came in and stood by the screens that now showed the cleared and organized final archive entries, and she looked at them for a moment. The implementation phase begins in 3 months, she said. The first therapeutic application of the protocol. The specialists are trained. The facilities are prepared. I know, Mara said. The Concord liaison sent me the schedule. I would like you to be present, as the protocol's author, as a scientific observer. Mara looked at her. She thought about the cold archive room, the violet light, the 31 hours, the word in small English letters on the screen. She thought about a second day and a brief ceremony, and a woman she had understood gradually was asking for something that no one had ever thought to ask a human before. That would mean an extended assignment, she said. Another 18 months through the full implementation cycle. I'd need to negotiate terms with the conquered, extend credentials, update my professional record. Yes, Isavarath said. I burn my toast every morning, Mara said. I have a cat in Hanover who is being fed by a colleague who is definitely not following the instructions I left. I am not a diplomat. I was not selected for any quality that diplomats are selected for. Isavarath was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I do not require a diplomat. I require the person who stood in the corridor and said, wait. Mara looked at her hands. 9 months of archive work had not improved the ink stains. She thought about the words she had seen in the notification 9 months ago, the procedural language designed to make significant things look routine. Suspended, not resolved, not finished, not the end of the conversation that had begun when an archivist stepped out of a room and didn't come back. She thought about the kind of species that arrived late to the galaxy and had nothing to unlearn and kept insisting on standing in corridors and using the specific word that the law required be said before it could proceed. The word was wait. The word was not yet. The word was, the certification is not complete, and until it is, nothing passes this point. All right, she said. Through the narrow window behind her, the threshold district moved through its morning the same way it had moved through every morning for the past 9 months. Somewhere in the lower levels of the building, a procedural file had been closed, and a sentinel had returned to wherever sentinels went when they were no longer assigned, and in the Imperial Genetic Archive, a notation had been changed. She had to query the archive system to find the translation for the new status marker, because she had not seen it before. The system returned the word in 3 languages. In the High Register, it was the same word used for the long future itself, the covenant with continuity, the governing philosophy of a civilization that had spent 11 centuries learning to outlast extinction. In the conquered's diplomatic tongue, it came back as continuation. In English, which the archive had been calibrated to include at a specific point in the last several years, when a queen had understood she needed a certain kind of reader, it said one word. Possible. Mara picked up her materials. She followed the queen out into the corridor and down toward whatever came next, carrying 9 months of notes and 300 simulations, and a methodology document that was the first human-originated research in an alien imperial archive. And she did not look back at the room where she had sat alone, and found a thing that centuries of brilliant specialists had not known to look for, because they had been inside the framework too long to see its shape from the outside. The cold light held at the corridor's end and stopped there, and after that there was only the sound of 2 sets of footsteps moving forward, a human from a young species that had nothing to unlearn, and a queen from an old one learning, slowly, what it looked like when something entirely other turned out to be exactly what was needed. In the Empire's official record, the entry for this period would be 3 formal sentences in the High Register: a suspension, a certification, a path of continuation confirmed. It would say nothing about a human researcher who burned her toast and talked too quietly and sat down on the floor of a corridor when the tension broke. It would say nothing about 2 sets of footsteps and the word possible, and what it cost an immortal civilization to understand that living forever had never been the same thing as knowing how to survive. Mara carried that knowledge in her ink-stained hands, forward into whatever came next, which was the only place it had ever needed to go.